We're going to go over the most critical thing we need to keep in mind when approaching 2-minute speeches. How do we approach the content of it? And finally, how do we start and conclude them? The very first thing, the approach. Now, before we even start writing the speech down, before we think about what to deliver and how we look and whatever it might be, we need to make one thing very, very clear to ourselves. And that is, what is the takeaway for the audience? What do we want them to do at the end of the speech? Do we want them to act on something? Is there a question that we want them to ponder over? Or do we want them to vote or anything along those lines? To some of you, it might sound obvious, but the biggest mistake that some of us make when it comes to short speeches is that we don't have a defined takeaway. And it makes our speech become very vague and go in multiple directions. Ideally, when we're giving a short speech like this, it's good to have just one takeaway. After we clearly establish that, then we move on to the content. For 2-minute speeches, I like to take the approach of ethos, pathos, and logos. This was a persuasive speech model that was created by Greek philosopher Aristotle. And ethos means credibility, pathos means emotion, logos means logic. If we combine these three within a speech, we showcase our credibility, we move the audience emotionally, and we show them logic, there's a very good chance we can persuade them to do something in a short span of time. For instance, if we're giving a 2-minute speech on climate change, we need to at some point establish our credibility. Are you a student activist who's just extremely passionate about this cause? Or are you a scientist who's seen the effects of climate change firsthand? And establishing this credibility will go a long way in convincing your audience of whatever action you need them to take by the end of your speech. Then we move on to pathos, which is emotion. The best way to capture an audience's emotion, especially in a short span of time, is to simply say a story. Taking the example of climate change, there's a reason why that standard image of the polar bear standing on a block of ice is so famous. It's because that image communicated a story that hit all of us on an emotional level. But at the same time, it's important to keep in mind that if you're talking about a generic topic like climate change that's been spoken about so often, we need to keep these emotional hooks unique. If we were to show the image of the polar bear on the block of ice, it's not going to make a difference to anybody because most of the audience has become numb to this. It's been repeated to them so many times that it just does not make a difference anymore. Which means we need to approach emotional angles from a unique standpoint. So instead of repeating things that have been said over and over again, we can take different ways to appeal to the audience emotionally. There's a great TED Talk on climate change by Finnegan Harris, where he talks about a more creative approach to dealing with climate change, about how we can use films and photography to convey different messages and activate people's emotions, or how we can use design to restructure certain environmental problems. And that automatically becomes a lot more compelling story. And finally, we have logos. The best way to add logic into your speech is by using credible evidence, like facts and figures that drive your point forward in a more rational sense. Once we combine these three, it'll allow us to give a compelling speech in a short amount of time. Just keep in mind, we don't need to follow the order of ethos, pathos, and logos exactly. We can mix it up depending on how we want our speech to be. So what is the best way to start a 2-minute speech? I'm usually a fan of starting speeches with an attention grabber to hook the audience's attention, but in short speeches like these, we don't necessarily need to do that. We can simply start off with, I'm going to keep this short. Or let's get started and directly dive into the points that we're supposed to dive into. We can also begin with pathos and start by narrating an emotional story. Or we can begin with using logos by stating off a shocking fact. But the beginning in 2-minute speeches is not that important as it would be in speeches that are 5 minutes or longer. And finally, when it comes to closing the speech, the only thing that we need to do is to close with our main takeaway. What is the final action that we want people to take after our speech is done, and end it with that? Because the end is what the audience will remember the most. Now, if you want more examples on speech endings and speech closings because you have the liberty to be more creative in your circumstance, I'm linking 2 videos in the description below where we go over many examples of speech closings and speech opening lines that you can get inspiration from. At the same time, if you're giving a shorter speech, which is not 2 minutes long, but it's just 1 minute long, and you're looking for frameworks that you can use to make sure you're capturing all the important points, check out this video right here.